giving folks a second to find their way in. All right, welcome back, everyone. So, as promised, we are super excited to have Dr. Tommy J. Curry join us today at this most special event, focusing on Black men and boys and the violence and pain that they experience in America. I'm going to read off Dr. Curry's bio, and then he's going to take it from here. Dr. Tommy J. Curry is a professor of philosophy and holds a personal chair of Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh. His research interests are 19th century ethnology, critical race theory, and Black male studies. He is the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Gender, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, which won the 2018 American Book Award, as well as the author of Another White Man's Burden, Josiah Royce's Quest for a Philosophy of Racial Empire, which recently won the 2020 Josiah Royce Prize in American Idealist Thought. His research explores anti-Black racism, anti-colonial resistance, and the sexual vulnerability of Black males through Western society. Welcome, Dr. Curry.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. So first off, thank you so much for hosting me to the organization. Black male studies is an emerging area and field that's dedicated to understanding the realities of Black men and boys, and it's created quite a stir in the academy, largely because it's looking at how Black males suffer, how Black males' lives and their life chances refute many of the assumptions that we have of male privilege or patriarchy. But in this presentation, what I like to present to the audience is a summary of data that's looking at how Black men are perceived, how they're presented to the world, and how their death and dehumanization actually operate within American democratic societies. So the first thing that we understand is that we all acknowledge that contemporary civil rights movements, protests, and other political campaigns have been waged around the death of Black men. But despite the fact that Black men are the major symbols of these movements like BLM, we often find that Black males are absent. So we see in America a shift between the symbolism of progressivism that celebrates the corpse of the dead Black male as something to rally around. But we don't see the lives of Black men as a progressive element in civil society. That means that progressive symbols of racial progress often depend on the absence of Black men as political leaders, as theorists of American racism, and as victims of sexual violence. Throughout the last several years, the campaigns around BLM have offered the Black male to America as a corpse. Young Black boys, as illustrated by this picture, are presented to the world as dying, as dead. Now, for many people, this simply is a photograph, but I would urge us to think differently about this. In the Man Not, I argue that part of the reasons that Black men are so dehumanized is because Black men are overdetermined by their corpse. By this, I mean to say that it's the dead body of Black men and boys that seem to represent the cause of social activism, but we know very little of their lives. We empathize with their mothers. We don't empathize with the young Black boy that's playing lifeless in her arms. And it's this dichotomy between the dehumanized thing and the humanized object that we see in the Black mother that pulls us apart from what we're trying to figure out constitutes Black male mental health, Black male psychology, and Black male existential worth. Now, the mutilated Black male is something that's been presented to the world many times before. The Black male corpse is presented to the world as an example of the horrors that American racism imposes on Black men and boys. The dead Black male corpse is a symbol of victimization and is in the grotesqueness, right? The sheer horror of what happens to Black male bodies. That this symbol is used to garner recognition and expose the kind of dehumanized status that the black male has even when he's alive. But what happens when the corpse of the black man is shown to audiences for centuries? What happens is a disconnection between the value of his life and the values of those who present his body. So the black male is humanized not by his loss of life. We don't see black men as worthwhile of preserving. We don't see black men and boys as something that we're interested in investing in and valuing as they're living. Rather, we look at the people who seem to be impacted by their loss and death. And in this case, in the National Geographic magazine, notice the phrase: for America's black mothers, the fear of loss and trauma is constant. Now, we would certainly never deny that black men and boys are parts of families, neighborhoods, communities, churches, etc. But the question that I really want to get us to start thinking about in this presentation is, well, what value do we have on black male life? What values do black men have, or images do they have of themselves? And how is that impacted by the societal forces that are constantly aiming to dehumanize black men and boys in our contemporary society?
What's up, cuz?
Now, when we go to Fanon's phobogenetic analysis, we can see that he anticipated the findings of many of these ideas back in the mid 20th century. Now, for Fanon, he argues that the black man lives in a world as the reflection of white society's fear. He is, as Fanon says, a phobogenic object, a stimulus to anxiety. He is terror in the white mind. The fear the black man represents, his sight imagining him as a sexual partner, is the origin of white violence against him. So the mere contact with his blackened body activates the neuroses of the white mind, whereby the physical proximity the white observer has to the black male body triggers a fleeing of the white mind from reality, or more accurately, the relation to blackness the white body cannot escape. So Fanon's phobogenetic theory argues that the recognition of the black male being is impossible because of the fear triggered by the black male operates to ontologize and otherize black males into objects of threat and anxiety. This has been theorized by people like David Marriott and as well as Dr. Oluwaymi. So we're looking at a situation where our social reality is not fractured but formulated around identifying black men and boys as threats. And it's this kind of anxiety and fear as it exists in the white mind that projects the stereotypes that we see on black men and boys in our contemporary American society. We call this in black male studies anti-black misandry. So when we theorize the cause and the operation of anti-black misandry, or the fear or hatred of black men and boys, we're trying to understand how different ideological formations, psychological tropes, or even certain unconscious biases construct black men as threats, and then not so much that it's that we're fearful, but how that fear is used to dehumanize and make them into caricatures of something that is not human. So a few things is that we have to understand that American democracy actually thrives alongside black male mortality. Contrary to the way that we traditionally think of a democratic society where every individual is free and spared of violence, that's not the case for black males. American democracy seems to do quite fine historically for centuries, as black men are lynched, as black men are enslaved, as black men are degraded, mutilated. These have all been symbols. They've existed. They have coincided with every single era of democratic progress. We see population that are prematurely marked. We understand them as a demography of death and dying. The second thing we have to understand is that the loss of black male life is often interpolated by leftist identity politics as a progressive cause that requires new resources and policies to save other black groups worth saving. And this is important because when we focus on black men and boys losing their life, what often happens is we focus on their dead black bodies, but then use those dead black bodies to enrich other black groups that are more palatable to the leftist politics, right? So we see a shift, for example, in Black Lives Matter, even though 97% of black people killed are black men, to questions of black female death, black sexual minorities, etc. We even see a class dynamic emerging here. So while we can see disproportionate rates of lethal violence being deployed against black men and boys do not become center in our understanding of which black lives are worthy of protection, much less which black lives have value intrinsically to themselves. And lastly, I want us to think about how the dehumanization of the black male remains a linchpin of American racial phobics and liberal progressivism that legitimizes state violence to maintain civility. Now, I'm sure we're all aware of the state programs against the Black Panthers and other Black militant groups. But what we haven't thought about is how the generation of Black male militancy has been utilized as a program of counterinsurgency, as well as a program that justifies the most inhumane and violent ways to control Black populations. People like Huey P. Newton, Sylvia Winter, and of course my own work tries to show that it's the existence of Black male as a dissident population as someone and as or as a group that's exploding with revolutionary potential that also causes black men to be disproportionate victims of lethal violence and homicide as well as mass incarceration. So when we think about the act of dehumanization, we're not thinking of a descriptive term. We're not just saying that black men are described as something other than human. We're suggesting that black men are not are described and then treated through a series of institutional mechanisms like the police or the mass incarceration system as something less than human and then civilly removed from society. Now, this process of removing black men from society has been called gendercide. Augusta Del Zotto suggests that when we look at the United States, we can understand the systematic objectification and control of the poor, particularly black males, play an important role in maintaining the desired social order. Del Zotto suggests that's informed by a long historical tradition of objectifying black males. While the black female is a threat that can be controlled through policies of manipulation, the black male as a threat requires the implementation of policies of direct force to keep him at the margins, and policies of containment to ensure that he does not encroach upon the serenity of growing industrial parks and gated communities. So anti-black misandry then is a term that we use to express the cumulative assertions of black male inferiority due to errant psychologies of lack, dispositions of deviance, or hyperpersonality traits like hypersexuality or hypermasculinity, which rationalize the criminalization, phobics, and sanctioning of black male life. Said differently, the apparatus that we have in American society that wants to imprison, kill, or remove black men from society is due to a misandric drive. The assumption that black men are pathological, the assumption that black men are deviant, or the assumption that black men are hypersexual and prone to deviance. These ideas, which are circulating in our everyday media, that are taught to us in the classroom, which find their home in contemporary gender or intersectional theory, have yet to be exposed or actually refuted empirically. So there's a few things that we need to point out. The first is that the hierarchy of racial groups depends on solidifying boundaries between these groups marked for civility and social elevation and the downward and wretched groups. In this case, we're talking about black men. The second thing is that the demonization and mortality of black males actually sustains social hierarchy in the United States. The work of Jim Sedanius and Felicia Prado, as well as my earlier work in The Man Not, suggests that we could see the homicide rates, we could see the exclusion of black men or the discrimination against black men in American society as a way to increase or create positive capital amongst other groups. Next, as theorists and philosophers, these demographic trends and pathological explanations require us to reconstruct the historical patterns of contemporary political discourse that frame Black subjectivity in the United States and abroad. And the systematic repetitions of Black male death require a more serious study of how race and racial patterns of violence require the dehumanization of Black men and boys as the foundation of progressive and reformist social stances, racial stances, and theory. So black men and boys then become a centerpiece of how we understand dehumanization and violence to actually operate in American society. This means that we have to pay specific attention to how black men and boys are negated in our everyday life. So when I talk about attentional deficit, I'm really interested in the negative consequences that recognizing black men in our everyday lives have to their mental state and to their actual existential worth. So let's understand, let's get a few things clear here. We have to understand the role that racism plays in relationship to the black male target. Now, many people like to draw an analogy or parity between racism and sexism, and nothing could be further away from the truth. Unlike sexism, which has both hostile and benevolent aspects, so you can hate women, but you can also have benevolent and positive aspects of women, that they're nurturers, that they belong in the home, that they're lovers, that they're meant for reproduction, etc., versus something hostile that wants to eliminate or punish them, right? Racism is specifically linked with the highest forms of societal violence, social disregard, and dehumanization. Now, racism, which is popularly understood as discrimination or hatred of groups based on skin color, plays a completely different role in social stratification and structures when we investigate it empirically. So the first thing is that when we look at racism, racism is actually a manifestation of various social processes and concurrent logics that facilitate the death and dying of racially subjugated peoples. Said differently, when you look at racism, you see downward trends practically towards every measurable outcome, be it college education, wealth, life course, premature mortality. These are all negative things associated with racism. That's not necessarily the case when we look at something like sexism. The second thing is that racist stereotypes are not based on all members of a racial group. According to the work of Gavami and Pulo, overwhelmingly racist stereotypes are based on how white or dominant racial groups view the males of the subordinate racial group. So previous research has shown that stereotypes of an ethnic group will be more similar to stereotypes of the men than the women of that ethnic group. So that means that when we're looking at our talk about racism generally or anti-black racism specifically, we're not talking about something that affects all members of the group equally because the stereotypes that we have, say, of black people are overly determined by the concept that whites or the dominant group have specifically of black males. Now, this has been explained in previous literature by Sedanius and Venegas as the subordinate male target hypothesis. This group argues, or these theorists argue, that it's primarily outgroup males rather than outgroup females who will be the primary targets of arbitrary set discrimination. So while arbitrary set outgroup females will certainly suffer the effects of arbitrary set discrimination, largely from their close association with arbitrary set outgroup males in the forms of husbands, sons, fathers, brothers, and lovers, we should expect that arbitrary set outgroup females will not be the primary targets of arbitrary set discrimination. The reason behind this is the expectation that an arbitrary set discrimination is primarily a form of intersexual competition that's perpetrated by males and directed against males. So, for social dominance theorists like Jim Sedanius, arbitrary set discrimination can also be viewed as a form of low level warfare that is directed against outgroup males. So, social dominance theorists label this as the subordinate male target hypothesis. Now, contrary to the intuitive arguments that you often find under intersectional theory, the sociological data suggests that when we're looking at how racism operates and how it's perpetrated against members of an outgroup, males are the primary targets of interracial violence. Now, intersectionality has addressed this, but they do so in a very, very strange way. They want to suggest that while the empirical evidence is irrefutable, that Black men, especially, but racialized men more generally, are the targets of racial patriarchal societies, they want to read this as a form of privilege. According to Purdy Vaughns and Eibach, they want to suggest that the oppression of subordinate group men is in fact the product of psychological dispositions that evolved as males competed for resources in the human ancestral environment. But their model of intersectional visibility views the oppression of subordinate group men as a reflection of the general tendency in an androcentric society to view all men, both those of the dominant groups and of the subordinate groups, as more important than women. So it's this marginalization of women in an androcentric society that causes subordinate women to relatively be ignored as direct targets of oppression compared to subordinate men. So intersectional visibility makes the disproportionate deaths of Black men an actual privilege. And this is kind of the problem that we're running into both in the mental health literature and in the theoretical literature, because it wants to suggest that Black men are a disadvantaged but privileged group. The evidence suggests otherwise. And while intersectional invisibility wants to make the claim that Black men are privileged simply because they're being targeted for death more, it undercuts the role that dehumanization plays in the eradication of Black men, both psychologically and physically. So, as I've argued previously, intersectional invisibility holds a contradictory view of violence under patriarchal societies, which suggests this, that violence against women in a patriarchal society is evidence of their lower status and domination of the patriarchy, where the greater levels of violence against racialized men in the same society are not evidence of their dehumanization, but their privilege as men. So what this means is that we have a gap in how we're trying to understand and assess the problems that Black men have, which are of disproportionate negativity to their female counterpart and their white counterparts. I would argue that this is largely because of the ways that Black men are perceived and rationalized within the minds of the dominant group. This is what I call attentional deficit. So when we think about the visibility or recognition of a particular group and how that negates the possibility of that group's humanity or human qualities being assigned to members of that group, we have to think about how recognition is being assigned. So the deficit of being a racialized male is rooted primarily in being non-human and consequently defined by the caricatures of the dominant group. So, in this sense, recognition of black men, seeing a black man on the street, is not only misrecognition, right, mistaking him as a person for different racial stereotypes, but rather confining that black male, right, to the caricatures of oneself as they appear to the dominant group that can't be recognized as human. So philosophers and theorists often ignore the empirical evidence, which shows that humanity is not merely evaluated by the degree to which it's afforded bodies, but also its more sterling qualities or its inability to be sullied or diminished by its association with that which is non-human. So, as Fisk and Harris suggest in their study on neuroimaging and dehumanization, not all prejudices are equal, and members of some social groups seem to be dehumanized, at least as indicated by the absence of the typical neural signature for social cognition. So, contrary philosophical and theoretical debates concerning recognition and misrecognition, there's scientific evidence to show that some groups are not perceived as social beings at all within the minds of dehumanizers. And this is what I'm suggesting is the case for Black men and boys, which is why we see such negative psychological outcomes across the board, despite class, education, or age within that group. So that means that because certain groups of black men are because black men as a group are not seen as human beings, the caricatures, the ways in which they trigger threat and fear, right? The kinds of animals and rodents they're associated with take the dominant strain of how they're perceived socially. So what often happens within our contemporary intersectional language and our reformist mental health language is that we don't make adequate distinctions in the qualitative and effective differences of attention and recognition as is opposed on the black male. So black males are visible because their presence or even their names trigger fight or flight responses in whites. So a name associated with black males like Jerome or Tyrone can actually trigger survival instincts in whites to address the perceived formidability, meaning that they're bigger, stronger in size and stature, and more aggressive if they're black male targets. Also, when we look at the attentional focus or the eye gazing, we've seen some of the early studies where white teachers are tracking young black boys in preschool, right? So we're looking at attentional focus on black males. We can understand that this is due to a conscious and unconscious regulation of black men as threats. Trollwater and her colleagues explain in attending to the threat that the findings they found, that their findings suggest that in addition to affording stereotype consistent processing on tasks that explicitly tap or prime crime, race, and danger, black male targets may be privileged for attentional resources similar to more evolutionary significant threatening stimuli like snakes, spiders, or angry faces. Now think about what the Trollwater study is actually saying. Black men will be attended to in social spaces more than any other race sex group because people fear them, and then by fearing them associate them with things like snakes, spiders, or angry faces, things that are evolutionarily perceived as threats and dangers that are in need of elimination. What we've done is we've created discourses on black male mental health, black male recognition, and existential valuation that have not looked at the empirical and scientific data showing how black men are actually negated and dehumanized in our real-time social spheres. So if black men are not perceived as human beings, but rather a snake, a spider, or an angry face, then it explains why we have so many different qualitative metrics explaining why black men are the first are most likely to be killed or shot by even college educated whites, for example. So these kinds of arguments show how anti-black racism actually functions in the real world. That when we have black masculinity, it's the masculization, right, of a black man, and how that's set in relation to black women and black people generally, that enables groups to actually be erased or killed. As you can see from this data point by Coles and Pasick, what they're showing is black men have the highest range from white men, men generally, white people, etc., of masculization. In their study, they traced masculization to threat construction. So because black men are thought to be most likely to be threats, it means that black masculinity is one of the necessary conditions for violence generally amongst black people. Now, we see this across multiple national statistics as well. For example, the National Center for Health Statistics that looks at mortality. When you look at the disproportionate rates, and I controlled this, I picked 2018, 2019, so it wouldn't be affected by the disproportionate rates of COVID deaths. You can see that black men disproportionately disproportionately suffer from premature death per 100,000 compared to every other group in the United States, whites and Hispanic males and females. Now, we see this kind of demographic trend of black male mortality and disadvantage across multiple specters here. So we see it from life expectancy, right? Having the lowest life expectancy in the United States, again, pre COVID numbers. We see it in a regression model that's looking at the percentage of people surviving by the ages up to certain ages of 20, 30, up to 100. And you can see the negative, the downward trend that black men have, right? That they have the lowest life expectancy, roughly starting from the age of 20 compared to any other group. So even when we factor in these kinds of statistics, we then have to also deal with external threats like police killings. So being black and male increases the risk of being killed by the police compared to all groups. So black men are around 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police over a life course than white men. Black women are about 1.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white women. But among all groups, black men and boys face the highest lifetime risk of being killed by police. The authors of this study by Edwards Lee and Espasto concluded that roughly 96 per 100,000 black men will be killed over their life course as compared to 5.4 per 100,000 black women. Now we illustrate this graphically. This is what it looks like. So it suggests to us that both Fanon's theory of phobogenesis, as well as the work of people like Trollwater, explain how the construction of black male threat is related to police killing. There's an effective dimension to how black men perceive themselves in the real world and how they're treated, and the kinds of actions that we want to actually stop and arrest that we think negate black men's existential worth. So if we say that we think black men should have positive images of themselves, the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, what does the society allow? If a society only allows for black men to be constructed as deviants, criminals, and threats or rapists, then we have a different project in mind when we're talking about mental health. It is not located simply within the psyche of the individual, but it has to be drawn communally into what the social function and the operation of various stereotypes and dehumanizing logics are playing on that group more broadly. Now, this kind of work has been explored tremendously by people like Ashby Plant. In her work, she found that in shootings, femaleness actually creates a disincentive towards lethal violence that's similar to white in-group membership. So, in line with the previous study that showed that masculinization triggers, right, anti-black racist violence, this study showed that when you actually look at who's being shot, if you're a female, it disassociates you with some of the negative stereotypes directed towards blacks generally. So she found in their study that white participants showed a pronounced bias towards shooting black men, but a bias away from shooting black women and white in-group members. So participants in their studies were biased away from shooting the female suspects, even when those female suspects were armed. Specifically, when responding to black and white women, participants tended to make more mistakes of not shooting armed suspects than mistakenly shooting unarmed suspects. So what she found is that when you look at the percentage of errors, right, of unarmed black men were shot the most. They had so many mistakes in shooting them. So even when black and white women were armed, they made the mistake of not shooting them more than they would shooting unarmed black men. So again, when we look at what the data shows us, it shows us that maleness is a deleterious category. That when we understand the specific oppression that black men suffer, it's not simply because they're black, but there's something about melanin that triggers the threat construction and the dehumanization that makes their lethal extermination a norm and accepted, even legitimized in a specific society. So let's ask ourselves this. When we discuss black men as clients, as a group, are subjects of vulnerability, we often narrow our focus on police killings, the mass incarceration system, our prison industrial complex, are mechanisms of the state. But in trying to understand a holistic picture of Black men and boys, we have to start looking at their vulnerability to intraracial gendered violence. Now, I want to give a little background here. Most of our conversations in public health rely on outdated theories of violence and deviance. Our contemporary theories of gender, be they written by Bell Hooks or Kimberly Crenshaw, often suggests that there is a natural propensity for violence and deviance amongst Black men, which explains some of their negative outcomes, be it their hypermasculinity or their proclivities towards violence. What I like to suggest to you is that these are not actual theories, but the remnants of racist criminological theory that was picked up by early feminists in the United States. So the people that you have here on your left, these are subculture violence theorists. These are Miniature Mamir, Wolfgang, and Farracuti. Now, these subculture violence theorists argued that Black masculinity was compensatory and used violence, sexual aggression, and deviance as social cultural capital because Black men were denied political and economic opportunities in the larger society. These theories were then picked up by white feminists like Susan Brown Miller in her book Against Our Will to talk about why poor Black men were not only prone to higher rates of criminality, but also prone to rape and other forms of sexual deviance. In the early 1980s, two white feminists named Joyce Williams and Karen A. Holmes introduced this idea that Black men used rape, sexual aggression, and violence to bolster their notions of Black masculinity. And these theories created racial sexual stratification theory as a precursor to intersectionality and Black feminist theories of Black masculinity. Now, because we've emerged from reading Black male mental health through intersectional frames over the last 2 decades, many of the Black feminist commentaries that we've read by people like Hooks, people like Jamelia Lemieux, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, have suggested that Black male oppression has to be viewed with an eye towards their perpetration of violence. So, in this way, people like Lemieux have suggested to us that Black male oppression is negotiated with the other dangers they pose to other Blacks. In this way, she suggests that Black men have always been and continue to be profiled, stereotyped, and mistreated based on a pervasive mythology that there are Black men among us, not the majority, of course, who are abusive and violent, that sometimes those men are the ones who really love, and that because the majority of the violence committed by those individuals be inflicted on other Black people, it's a Black concern. She then says men have always been violent and men of all races rape are not reasons for us to ignore that Black women face higher rates of sexual assault, domestic violence, and murder than most other groups of women in this country. Now we see the same kind of idea that's perpetuated by people like Bell Hooks, because Bell Hooks suggests that Black men understand manhood and as violence and their ability to create fear in others. So she actually says that many Black males explain their decision to become the beast as a surrender to the realities they cannot change. And this is very important because the idea is that when Black men suffer from, higher rates of poverty, imprisonment, various forms of discrimination, they don't have positive resources, but reactionary resources that make them the beast and more violent. And she says, if you're going to be seen as a beast, well, you might as well act like one. Young Black males, particularly underclass Black males, notice the same kind of argument we get from subculture violence theory, poor underclass Black men often derive a sense of satisfaction from being able to create fear in others, particularly in white folks. Showing aggression is the simplest way to assert patriarchal manhood. Men of all classes know this, and as a consequence, all men living in a culture of violence must demonstrate at some point in their lives they're capable of being violent. So even when we looked at something like the Central Park Five, right, but young Black men who we know were set up by the NYPD and that have now been exonerated, right, we see Hooks giving an analysis suggesting that it's sexist thinking, that is Black men who are victims of patriarchy, right? That through an analysis of combining feminist analysis with race and masculinity, that we see that since male power within patriarchy is relative, men from poorer groups and men of color are not able to reap the material and social rewards of participating. So they blindly suffer from passively acting out a myth of masculinity that's ultimately life threatening. And as she concludes, isn't it rather naive to think if Black men don't value their own lives, they'll value the lives of others? Is it really so difficult for folks to see the connection between the constant pornographic glorification of male violence against women that's represented and acted and condoned daily in the culture and the Central Park crime? Now, the reason this quote is important is because we come to the evaluation and study of Black men with a certain set of biases and theoretical tools. And what I've tried to show thus far through the presentation is that because we have certain stereotypes of black men as fundamentally non-human, violent, aggressive, etc., the demonization of black men becomes rationalized within contemporary gender theory as saying that black men, sure, they may suffer, but black men are also violent perpetrators. And this is what negates our ability to empathize and truly appreciate the vulnerability that we see proven empirically about black male cognition and rationalizations. So, for these people, drawing from subculture violence theory, black masculinity is pathological. As Minister Ramirez suggested in his book Forcible Patterns of Rape in the 1980s, the Negro male's aggressive sexuality seems to be more problematically due to a strong need to overcome the problems of masculinity and sexual identity. This is so because the Negro family structure, which is mother based, and the needs to overcome general societal disadvantages by substituting sexual aggressive masculinity for the failures of a man in economic and social status spheres. So these people argue that black masculinity has historically been different, that black boys are imbued with negative and ambivalent feelings towards masculinity, and sexual and aggressive behavior becomes the main vehicle for asserting their worthiness. Right. This is why they idealize personal violence and prowess because it substitutes for social and economic advantages that we would traditionally assume would be passed on through education. But the data doesn't support these claims. It doesn't support the claims of Bell Hooks, Jamila Lemieux, and Kimberly Crenshaw. When we look at how black men are made vulnerable across their life course, right, we see that it's not simply them being killed by police or them being incarcerated. Black men suffer disproportionately from intimate partner homicide. They suffer disproportionately from child abuse and child sexual abuse. And they suffer from tremendous amounts of psychological abuse and neglect. Now, looking at the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the FBI 1998 supplement, we can see that from 1976 to the mid 1990s, black men had one of the highest rates of intimate partner homicide in the United States. We see this again when we're looking at the age groups of 20 and 24 cohort per 100,000. Now, again, this doesn't suggest that other groups don't disproportionately suffer, but it is to point out that the way that we perceive the mental health and overall uh, status of black men as a vulnerable population has often not looked at the dynamics of how they're constructed theoretically and what they suffer within communities. We turn a blind eye to how black men and boys suffer over life course. When we look at even contemporary lifetime and 12-month prevalence rates from NIVS data, we can see what we traditionally tend to expect when we look at domestic violence. We see disproportionate rates of domestic violence amongst American Indian women, amongst black women over lifetime and in 12-month prevalence. But the thing that we often ignore is that we also see in the same data set the disproportionate amounts of violence that black men suffer, right, from intimate partner violence, contact sexual violence, etc. So if we look at 12-month prevalence, we see 11.6% of weighted percentage. Over life course, we see 40%. But there's no literature that even investigates whether or not some of the negative health consequences and associations with depressive symptoms of black men are related to different forms of interracial violence or sexual vulnerability. When we actually talk about something like sexual violence, we can see the exact same pattern as a whole, that there's a bidirectional nature to it. Again, when we look at black women and black non-Hispanic contact sexual violence and rape, we see disproportionate rates compared to their white counterparts, right? Again, we expect to see this. Poverty, neighborhood, rates of neighborhood violence, residential violence, all impact the rates of intimate partner homicide and sexual violence amongst the population. We know this within various ecological factors. But when it comes to black men, even though the data shows the exact same thing, disproportionate rates of contact sexual violence, slightly higher than their female counterpart, higher rates of made to penetrate violence. And actually, from research that I've recently just published, we see the same thing in age of sexual debut. Disproportionate rates of black boys are introduced to sex through statutory rape. These kinds of ideas continue to generate and regenerate elements of dehumanization and neglect that is not only not taken account of in the literature, but is absolutely neglected by clinicians throughout the country. So, what we then find is that we build categories around certain forms of violence that render black men pathological and perpetrators, right? Like the idea of rape, for instance, while negating or outright erasing their ability to be vulnerable to it. So our conceptualizations of groups are often based on presumptions of group tendencies. that are the consequences of identity traits rather than actual patterns of group behavior. And what I mean by this is that we'll say men are more likely to rape, and we have a negative association or stereotype of black men as rapists. So that identity trait, right, without appealing to any empirical evidence, right, then becomes the basis of us treating and theorizing the underlying motivations or dispositions of a certain client or vulnerable group population. So that means that race and gender theories are often asserted to be empirically informed, thinking back about what Lemieux says, thinking back what people like Bell Hooks is saying, and when they're merely deleterious constructions of groups that make their ideological positions cohere. So in the case of black men, stereotypes are used to justify broad-based generalizations of black male behavior and psychology despite the evidence. And I want to give you a really good example of this. Looking again at the same NISVS data set, pulling from the 2010 numbers, where they were looking at rape, physical abuse, bisexual orientation, we can see that you have a higher percentage of physical violence amongst lesbian populations in the United States. Same thing with rape, physical violence, and stalking compared to, say, bisexual and heterosexual groups, right? Well, if you look at bisexual lesbian group or bisexual female groups, you have a higher rate than heterosexual groups, right? Now, despite this being a long-standing feature in various systematic reviews, other sexual minority groups that exhibit higher rates of perpetration or victimization are not theorized as owing such disparities to some essential characteristics. Said differently, when black men perpetrate disproportionate rates of domestic violence, there's something wrong with black masculinity. When bisexual women or lesbian American women have higher rates of physical violence and domestic violence than black men, nothing about that group is essentialized. We don't say, well, because a woman's bisexual or because she's a lesbian, she's more likely to perpetrate violence against another woman. But with black men, we do. And it's this kind of categorical association with blackness and maleness that the data I presented earlier shows is that masculization is that hook that that latches negativity onto the black male body. And even when we look at other groups of men, we see the same thing, right? We see varying rates of domestic violence, physical violence, sexual assault, etc. But there's nothing that allows gay men or bisexual men to be associated with these crimes, whereas black men are, right? So the variation that we see naturally occurring within various data sets that shows that very differing groups of men have different or disproportionate rates of violence, be it physical, sexual, etc. They're not essentialized, but black men are. Black men are pathologized and said to be the cause of these kinds of things. So that means that we have to start thinking differently about black male mental health. Given the evidence of the kinds of negations and dehumanizations that are associated with being black and male in the United States, what we have to then ask ourselves are, well, what associates black maleness with some of these kind of negative health outcomes despite their class status? So, quoting from a good colleague of mine, Shervin Asari, what we see is that when we're looking at something like, major depressive disorder, right? All the way from Black youth, tracing it through life course, we see that high socioeconomic status does not mediate, right, depressive symptoms for Black males. Now, notice this runs contrary to the literature because socioeconomic status is thought to have a protective effect, right, against certain forms of mental health, certain forms of disease, and overall just quality of life days. But when it comes to Black men and boys, high socioeconomic status doesn't mediate major depressive disorders. So that means that we have something to think about here. We often think that class elevation is a remedy for racial problems, but what we're showing through the data is that through various studies is that class elevation does not change the social cognition or the psychological disposition that black men and boys have of themselves despite their class status. So that means that there's another phenomenon operating within the social structures and within social ideology that negates black men at an existential level that can't be accounted for economically. So this means that even when we think of something like higher education or the world of education on depressive symptoms, right? It too is shown to not have any protective effect against major depressive disorders. So we see that black men, even when they get higher education, go through college, have positive social capital networks, right? They found an inverse relationship. The higher education was actually more associated with increased depression amongst black males, right? And though this does give some credit that there are protective features of higher education, but not in terms of depression and self worth. So this means that our understanding of being black and male in the United States is much more complex than simply trying to attend to self esteem or positive ideation. Rather, we're trying to discuss a feature of a social reality that designates a group for extermination based on the negative assumptions and perceptions of what that group is and what it will become. In my book, The Man Not, I talk about the killing of black boys as an attempt to kill the cub before he becomes a beast. And I think it's appropriate here because we're not only seeing that there's a physical elimination of black men and boys, but we're also seeing that this operates on a psychological level. So mental health is a function and an extension of the social structure and its intentionality. So that's why we also have to think about black boys as children. I know some of the other data talks about the adultification of black boys and the role that plays in threat construction. But this study by Asari is fascinating because what it shows is that the specific kinds of childhood discrimination that's directed against black boys endures over their life course. Not in the same way, but it doesn't happen in the same way for black girls. Now, the reason I think this is a really important study and a really important finding is because it suggests to us that the kinds of studies that were presented earlier about masculinization being a precursor to racial violence, of racial stereotypes being based almost solely on black men and boys in a racial group, it suggests that the qualitative and effective impact of discrimination is of such a nature that how we think of one being in the world is something that starts when they're a child. So if we take the perspective that we're trying to get black men into mental health services in their adulthood, what we miss is the cumulative problems and impact, the harms and injury that discrimination caused in childhood. And I can tell you, as someone that studies child sexual abuse, in our interviews, we found that black men usually don't disclose child sexual assaults until they're well into their adulthood. We're talking 20s and 30s. In fact, for some of our participants that we interviewed, they said this was the first time they ever thought back about their first sexual experience and interpreted it as sexual abuse or statutory rape. So this suggests to us that if we're looking at clinical protocols or how we're dealing with clients, that we don't have a very good assessment for how we can both gauge the kinds of harm that's been created or treat the kinds of harms that we can't see. What I've been trying to suggest in my work for going on a decade uh, is that our story about black men and boys is not as simple a story as what is black masculinity or how should black masculinity function. It's not a story of whether or not black men possess traditional values or non-traditional values. What it is a story about the will that we have to fight against a society that marks certain groups of people for death and dying and enforces that through the most terrible and horrific ways in our modern day world. So, understanding misandric aggression and the place that black men hold in a society as being disposable is fundamental not only to how we think about saving the lives of black men and boys and black people generally, but also in terms of the role that we have as clinicians, practitioners, and public health scholars in identifying what is creating less quality of life for that target population. So thank you very much, and I'll now open myself up for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curry. Such important work. I know that was a lot of information to take on. So I'm going to bring up Devontae Johnson from WABAC, young man, organizational leader, but has particular interest in your work. And as he comes up, there's a couple of things that stuck out um, as your talk was going on. I was thinking kind of early on about the movements for Black life and Black Lives Matter, et cetera,
Mhm.
and how the folks who are leading those causes tend to be Black female bodies or feminine presenting,
Mhm.
whereas like the bodies that they're standing up for are typically Black males. Um,
Yes.
And the thing that's interesting to me about that is how often when black men and boys are made into things, right, are made to be bodies, there's like this overwhelming support to protect black men and black life. But on the other side of that, in life where black men and boys are living, that the conversation and the conversation is more negative,
Mhm.
and does not seem to be a matter of like we need to protect black men and boys, but more so we need to protect ourselves from. I'm wondering if that's something that you also see, or
No, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I think I wrote an article on BLM, kind of showing how the more the movement either distances itself from black men and boys or demonizes black men and boys, it gets increased white liberal support. So what we're dealing with is how there's a fundamental misrepresentation of what progressivism and radicalism mean for black people in our contemporary society. We continue to say that we march for black men and boys, but we're not humanizing them. So the same kind of dehumanizing rhetoric and images that we see presented by white supremacists or the alt-right of black men and boys is exactly the same kinds of negating images we see presented by Jamelia Lemieux. So when there's such overlap between these ideas, we really have to make a careful and direct intervention into how social discourse is shaping social policy and movements. The data is crystal clear on this issue of where black men and boys actually fit. But when we're trying to put this up against something like BLM, the Democratic National Platform, sexual minority rights, pick your poison, black men and boys are then cast as perpetrators, as violent members of a community that don't deserve to be saved. And what I'm suggesting is that we can trace this very idea in criminological theories that made black men internal threats to their own community. They were utilized not only by criminologists and psychologists and feminists to demonize black men, but are also being deployed to redirect resources away from a population that needs this kind of attention. So the seriousness of black male studies is that it creates a meta commentary on the kinds of grandiose theoretical claims that we get out of liberalism, feminism, and even the kinds of integrationist ideas we have in public health scholarship. You can say you want a society to integrate or you want a society to be equal, but if you're not pointing out as a meta critique of who's being excluded from that because they're thought to interrupt equality, then we're not doing our job. We often forget that the impact that people have in a society requires that we analyze how they interact with each other, how they get along. So if you have a view of black men and boys that they're threats to other people, it creates a rationalization that suggests, well, maybe if they were dead, the black community would be a little safer. Black men are violent in the home, so maybe if we remove black men from homes, they'll be a little safer. You see, these are the underlying stereotypes and logics that are behind all of our conversations about mental wellness and even public health. But because we don't want to interrogate them, we often follow the pack and say, "Oh, let's be intersectional. Oh, let's talk about this group of black sexual minorities." We can do that all day, but the question is who's being disproportionately most affected. And if 96 to 97% of black men and boys are being killed by cops, of those people who were shot by cops in the black community, then we have a problem that we need to address, right? Because the majority is telling us something about the overall disposition and impetus of these people in the society.
thank you, Dr. Curry. I'm going to introduce Devontae Johnson here on the stage with us. Devontae is the co-founder of WAVAC, that's Youth Voices in Action Collective. Founded there, they have three, I believe, chapters: one in Detroit, Michigan, Pittsburgh, PA, and Alabama. If y'all have something, if they have something else, I wouldn't be surprised to move. Devontae, if you would like to lead our Q&A, being a young man yourself, please do introduce yourself.
Peace, family. Thank y'all so much. Again, my name is Devontae. Pronouns are he, him, his, or te. And I'm really excited to be here. I was just typing up a question in the queue as soon as you said that. So I'm just going to read off of the question really quickly. Again, I am the founder. I have the honor and privilege to serve as the founder and principal of the Young Voices Action Collective. We are a Black youth-led Mutual Aid and Relational Organizing Coalition. With like Shannon said, we have chapters in Huntsville, Alabama, Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Anyway, I'm so excited for this conversation today, and so excited to ask my first question. In your studies, Dr. Tommy, first of all, also it's an honor to be with the Chris Hughes, Shannon William Hughes, and Tommy. So get a snapshot. I'm just playing. Okay. So in your studies, I'm curious to know how have you seen the connection between the lack of resources for Black men to the redirection of resources to the Black community, knowing that the Black man and has been one of like the foundation or pivotal points for like moving progressive policy. So like for instance, the George Floyd and many George Floyds beforehand, as the country witnessed like the murder of a Black man, and as we witnessed the mass murders or mass incarceration of Black folks across the country, how have you seen the connection of like, one, Black men don't have the opportunity to have these resources because we're like not here, and then two, how have you seen like that connection be redirect? How have you seen the connection between the lack of resources for Black men to the redirection of policy funds or resources to the Black community and other communities that benefit off of us?
No, thank you so much for the question. So I'll give a very explicit example of how I see resources lacking. The literature is pretty uniform in its opinion that domestic violence is caused by ecological factors, right? So if you think about, well, if you go into a violent community, high rates of crime, high rates of homicide, you'll probably find high rates of domestic violence. So poverty, residential segregation, right? Somebody has been abused previously, be it a man, woman, etc. Right? And if children see domestic violence, they reproduce that. Okay. Despite that, we still have disproportionate rates of Black men being removed from households and communities as a way to solve domestic violence. Now, why is that a lack of resources? Well, we know that as class increases, domestic violence decreases. There's an inverse relationship between those two phenomena. So if you invest in jobs, if you invest in childcare, if you invest in other programs for poor populations, be they Black, white, etc., you would find a decrease of domestic violence in those poor populations, right? Despite that, the national conversation, both by progressive blacks and radical blacks, is Black masculinity is broken. You see, the lack of resources economically and in terms of employment directly correlate with the outcome you're trying to solve. But despite that empirical relationship, you don't want to afford resources of education and employment to Black men and boys. You don't target them for that, right? So that's an example of the first question. We don't see Black men as being part of American social life, so we don't invest in them so that we can actually make them part of an economic or employment structure. Okay. To the second regard, you ask, well, what happens when we lack resources? Where have I seen the redirection? I think that's severalfold. We can look at the Democratic National Platform and talk about that. So when we see the death of Black men and boys, I often notice that they're not Black fathers that are chosen to represent the pain that they have for losing their sons, but rather as Black mothers. When we see different agendas, right? Think recently about Stacey Abrams when she tried to put forth a platform for Black men. There were no specific elements of a Black male demographic, right? All of these things, all of these things suggest to us that Black men can't actually be put at the locus of social policy. So even though Black Lives Matter happened again with disproportionate rates of Black male death, we see a huge increase of social recognition, presentation, book contracts, public talks, etc., Nobel Peace Prizes for Black sexual minorities or Black women. Redirecting the question away from the death and murder of Black men to larger questions of, say, sexual assault by police officers. Think about hose claw. Now, what's interesting about that is they overlook the tremendous amounts of sexual victimization that Black men experience during stop and frisks, right? Penetration by guns, screwdrivers, right? Digits, etc. But it's reframing and re-articulating the kinds of oppression that we see in police encounters where sexual assault becomes a female specific issue. So they'll say, well, Black men are killed, but Black women and other sexual minorities are sexually harassed. completely ignoring the fact that we have all these data and case studies of black men being outright raped by cops, right, during stop and frisk. So what do? We take attentional resources, we take policy and protocols, right, and direct it to who we then articulate and interpret as a vulnerable group, despite the evidence that says otherwise. So this is why we then got a national platform that gave stripper videos to get black men out to vote, but talked about the ways that entrepreneurial packages, bonds, and increased economic mobility would be the benefits of voting Democratic for black women, for instance. You see, you're treating the two populations differently. You're saying, hey, let's put strippers in a hip hop song to get black men out to the polls, but let's speak about black women in terms of what their economic viability will be as a middle class population if the Democrats win, if Biden wins again. And of course, you get the symbolism of Kamala Harris. So there's there's negative capital associated with black male political posturing and power. Say Clarence Thomas voting for Roe v. Wade, even though he doesn't represent the majority of black male opinion on abortion issues. But then you have positive capital associated with a cop that actually put black people in prison, like Kamala Harris, or any other kind of black female leadership or political posture and advancement. So I think those are two clear examples of how resources and policy are impacted or have a kind of trade off uh, with how we think of the position of black men largely in society.
Thank you so much for that. I think the that serves as like a perfect pivot into the second question. Have you witnessed pre-adolescent and adolescent boys participating in negative coping mechanisms like smoking weed, cigarettes, and drinking, etc.? And I wanted to also add on to that question: how have the lack of resources around mental health support and just being seen as black men in this country led folks to this funnel of like substance abuse and drugs?
Well, I usually study young black boys in terms of sexual victimization, child physical abuse. So I haven't really looked at the substance abuse literature too closely. I've had colleagues that have studied that. But what we often find is that substance abuse, like anything else, like alcoholism, is usually a way to cope. And those coping mechanisms are ecological. They're based in the certain kind of stressors in the social environment. So in order for us to get a better handle on the relationship between those two things, I think that it's imperative that we understand that for many young black men, they're coming from hostile social environments, hyper policed, hyper isolating, hyper segregated, and violent. And that creates a predisposition towards coping in some of these negative ways, which is why we need more mental health facilities, more social workers that are culturally competent, right? Going into those homes and those neighborhoods, right? Because this isn't just get you to the psychiatrist or psychologist. This is also having social workers that are able to interact with families and populations to explain the risks and vulnerabilities and who's going to be the best for them, right? And then at the larger level, I think it's up to the epidemiologists and the public health people to start trying to redirect policy and resources to those groups of people, right? But there is something interesting there is that in terms of what I do study in terms of physical abuse and child sexual abuse, um, there is the fundamental idea that if you have young boys, young black boys, in these environments, they will disproportionately suffer from child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, and dating violence amongst their female peers in junior high. So again, that tells us something about the kinds of social context that we're working with and we have to be aware of. Again, I don't want to give anyone the impression that I'm saying that it's deterministic. Not every black boy in this circumstance will behave this way. But it does mean that we have certain things that we need to look out for in terms of how black boys are being treated and what may be some negative coping mechanisms given the severity of of the violence in their backgrounds, neighborhoods, and areas. And hell, even their own homes.
I want to thank you for that. That has me thinking about how you'll censor sexual violence against Black men and boys, which I think is a really really important conversation that is never really had. And prior to other than like me kind of being like boys and men get whatever too. This is the first time that I've experienced that in academia. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to, and I do see the question in the chat, but since we're talking about these sort of maladaptive behaviors, if you can say a little bit more about the prevalence of sexual misconduct and violence against men and boys, Black men and boys, and the impact that it has on them not being like seen or heard or even being called that, right? Like it's not called rape molestation. It's not called anything.
Yeah, so there is give me 1 second. Let's see. Yeah. Can I share my screen again?
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah, so when we're talking about black male sexual victimization, we're often discussing some form of child sexual abuse that either continues or um, is also facilitated into other sexual experiences into adulthood. Uh, so when you're talking about black men and boys, we're dealing with the fact that there's very little research on this issue. But what I wanted to talk about really quickly was the prevalence. Okay. When we look at the prevalence, we don't national data sets don't usually count these people. So the CDC, for instance, will talk about made to penetrate violence, which is if the victim was made to or attempted to make sexual penetration without someone's consent as a result of physical force, when the victim is unable to consent due to drugs, etc. But in most of the studies, like the child maltreatment surveys by the Children's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, they don't keep it, and the CDC only starts their count at the ages of 18, right? So even though it shows that 25% of the victims uh, experienced that before they got into the data set, they don't count the material. They don't count the actual disparity. So this is what we know about prevalence. Okay, when we're actually looking at this Cox regression model, which is trying to estimate the age to which black men survive without having sexual intercourse. So you can see at the age of 12 for African American men, uh, the number like 85% survive, right? Now you compare that to Caucasian Hispanic, where 97 and 94% survive, right? So the lower the number means the less people are surviving without sexual intercourse. You look at age of 13, 70. By the age of 14, almost half of black boys have had some form of sexual intercourse. Remember, the age of consent in the United States usually is around 16 to 18. By the time you get to 16 years of age, only 28%, less than 30% of black boys have not had sexual intercourse. By the age of 17, practically 20%, only 20% have it. That means that 80% of black boys by the age of sexual consent or earlier have had some form of sexual intercourse. And you compare that to every other group, right? Black boys have the earliest sexual debut. So that means that when you compare them, of course, to their female counterpart, black women seem to survive at a much higher rate without having sexual intercourse. So it suggests that black boys are actually having sexual intercourse, at least by the testimonies of this study, with women who are either older peers or adult women. Now, this makes a huge difference in terms of how we understand statutory rape and child sexual abuse. When I show you the NISVS data sets, we looking from 18 years of age forward, those people are actually engaged in sexual intercourse and sexual victimization at higher rates than practically every other adult male group. This suggests that if we're taking it seriously, well, then sexual abuse and child sexual intercourse or child sexual assault is an event that runs through childhood to adulthood, right? So that means that our understandings of prevalence have to be fundamentally redirected away from these are isolated circumstances happening to individuals to there are certain kinds of social environments, ideologies, caricatures, etc., that are enabling groups of people to take sexual advantage of black men as children and into adulthood, right? And that's the difference of the framework when we're talking about the sexual abuse of black men and boys that has not been introduced into this kind of literature as of yet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Curry. I have another question from Dominique Jones in the chat. Dominique said, "What is the Black male studies perspective on the impact of someone with the political slash legislative resumes of Joe and Kamala as our president and vice president?" Also, sustaining that this interview is nonpartisan, just so it can be publicly said.
Well, I mean, black belt studies scholars are going to have lots of different views. I think some of the questions they would ask is what is the relationship between their notions of, say, criminal policy or social policy and the valuation or negation of black men and boys? And it would ask to what what aspect is say Kamala's black femaleness overriding her policies that are specifically directed towards poor black people, specifically poor black men. Um, I mean, black male studies is a paradigm that's trying to assess how different assumptions about democratic or Western patriarchal societies impact racialized males. So if I'm looking at Biden's policy or Kamala Harris's policies, say like student loan forgiveness, I would ask myself, in what ways does this disproportionately disadvantage black men, given that most black men, um, a large amount of black men are not college graduates, right? So they don't benefit from this specific kind of apparatus. What are the other jobs or other areas that black men go into instead of college that could be enhanced by federal subsidization, right? It's a way of perceiving things. It's not so much a political posture, and I think that's one of the major differences that black male studies has to say something like black feminism or intersectionality. Black male studies is not interested in making declarative statements that hold true across all space and time. It's not an ideology. It's saying that if you study a specific context with certain identifiable factors, those identifiable factors are going to lead us to different conclusions, right? And that's what's going on, right? That's what is being investigated. So it's not a definitive statement, so to speak, but those would be some areas of inquiry that I think a black belt studies scholar would try to investigate.
Thank you so much. I have another question on that, like that kind of ties into that same question as before. So as we've seen over cycle and cycle and cycle, this democratic institution or like system has continued to politicize the black man and make the black man an object of political game or political influence. And so I'm curious, as it refers back to my first question on like the lack of resources for black men, even though the black man is used to gain resources, how have the continual
Mhm.
disregard for black male humanity contributes to the lack of trust in black boys and men today?
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't. I mean, trust and compassion are things that we usually associate with human beings, right? That are worthy of some form of qualities and empathy. Black men and boys don't fit in that category. We see that across the data sets. So I think that if we take dehumanization seriously, then we're going to talk about the ways that black men and boys are being excluded from the emotions or range of care that we expect vulnerable populations to receive. And I'll give you a very clear example of this. I mean, think about it. Where in what other time period have we actually debated black men or any other group of people having privilege because they're killed more? I mean, part of our national discourse is that black men get more attention when they get shot. This is an extension of intersectional visibility logic that was picked up by Kelly Crenshaw. But think about the ridiculousness of this. Black men are 97% of the black people shot by cops. You are upset and saying that it is a privilege for the news to broadcast the 97% of the victims killed by police homicide than the 2 or 3%. And you're saying that that represents people caring about black men's lives more than black women's, even though black men are killed at 96 per 100,000 versus 5.4 per 100,000 over life course. You see, that's what I mean. That's a prime example of how the lack of investment and valuation of black male life leads to a trade-off of resources. If black men aren't valued, then their deaths don't mean anything. It's just an obstacle to the deaths to seeing the deaths of the people who really matter, which are going to be black women and other black sexual minorities. You see, and that's how dehumanization works. That's why people have historically been able to commit whole genocides, and the world's like, well, we don't care, right? Because we don't care about those people's lives. Same thing is happening in the United States around black men and boys. And people get so upset because when I show them data, like you can't argue with the data, right? Like the data is, you can say the data is incomplete, but you can't argue with the data. So we never get into an argument about, well, Tommy, you're wrong. The issue is we just don't like what you're saying because it refutes our political ideology. But I'm a scholar. I don't care about, I'm not a pundit. If the data says X and the history says X, I'm going to say X. That's just how it works. So, what we're trying to figure out is the relationship between the dehumanization that we accept as part of progressive politics, like intersectionality or the questions of invisibility, and the relationship that that has to the neglect of resources, centering, and political posture trying to remedy the problem, which is the disproportionate amount of black men being killed, shot, etc.
Dr. Curry said, I said what I said. I said what I said, and I got the receipts. Dr. Curry, I have another question. So we mentioned before that YBAC has 3 chapters working with like young people across the country with like various different issues, and a lot of those young people happens to be young men. And so just hearing from like this your studies and like listening even to this last like hour of the conversation, I understand now that the dehumanizing process doesn't start when we become a certain age, or it doesn't start
Right.
when we have an experience with a person. It's we're born into dehumanization. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious, a lot of the times when with the like young men we're working with, whether it's like in court or like in a healing space, healing centered space, a lot of times they've been labeled with like toxic masculinity, like
Yes.
in the beginning traits of toxic masculinity. And I mean, we're talking with like 13 to 21-year olds. And so can you draw the distinction between toxic masculinity and the pre-assumed notion of black masculinity and how they are often misunderstood?
Conflated. So that's somewhat difficult because toxic masculinity is a misrepresentation of hegemonic masculinity, which black men have nothing to do with. So I'll try to be very quick, very brief here. R.W.S. Connell created the theory of hegemonic masculinity as a way to talk about how middle class or rich white men in a dominant society or patriarchal society do not have to use force like guns or brute force or violence to accomplish their ends because they control wages, the media, state sponsorship, property, etc. So they don't have to, they no longer reside in a world where male aggression is the way that they actually get resources or control society. They now use it through soft power and ideology. Black men, according to R.W.S. Connell, are not hegemonic masculinities. They do not possess them because they don't control any means of capitalistic production, right? Black men are called marginalized. They're marginalized because they are beaten down by the capitalist means of production and victims to ideology. She's getting this from the idea of Robert Staples. So toxic masculinity has become this kind of all-encompassing term that feminism is used to say that any form of male aggression, violence, or deviance is in fact toxic. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is one, toxic masculinity resides on or is based on negative racial stereotypes that have historically been used to frame black men as deviant. So I read a little bit of that, with the subculture violence stuff, but it goes much, much deeper than that. So the very idea of like hyper masculinity, the idea that black men turn away from women and overemphasize masculine traits, this was thought to be a disorder specific to black men because black men didn't have fathers in the home. So by being raised by women, they start taking on female characteristics and female personality traits. And then when they couldn't perform them in their male bodies, they turned away from those traits, rejected them, and became hyper deviant. Now, these kinds of assumptions, and there's even a study by Platt that shows that when you're talking about toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity, is predominantly used in academic literature to refer to black and brown men. So that's the first part. Basically, toxic masculinity has an insidiously racist history. The second part is, well, let's just test it. When you look at traits of, say, toxic masculinity, the idea that women are inferior, the idea of inequality between the sexes, the idea of being nationalist and trading off with female rights, none of those things actually apply to black men. Because black men, when you test them empirically, are the most egalitarian, they're the most pro woman, they're the most social policy and child welfare based group of men that the world's ever known. So when people label certain things toxic masculinity, as I said earlier, they're trying to create masculinity as a causal factor in the behaviors that people have rather than trying to say what is it this group thinks, right? Because we know from the work of Wisdom Powell, for instance, that black men don't really think of themselves in terms of masculinities, but rather in terms of manhood and an interdependent and communal nature of how they interrelate to other groups of people, right? How do those groups actually define themselves? And if you think that's the argument or that they're toxic, how does that theory of toxicity actually line up to the values that that specific community possesses? And the reality of the situation that it doesn't, because practically every ethnographic study that we have on black men disproves the arguments about toxic masculinity, right? So, toxic masculinity is a racist framing that is used to try to justify the idea that black men are violent, sexually aggressive, and pathological. That has very little to do with the evidence of black men in various communities and more to do with the overall hatred and misandric aggression towards black men in general. Sorry, Miss Williams, I can't hear you.
Mrs. Hughes, we
Hear me now?
cannot hear you.
No? Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. My bad, tech. Um, thank you so much for that very thorough explanation. In the interest of time, we're going to take one last question. Chris, I see you had a question in the chat. Would you still like to present that?
Yes, Dr. Curry, you made an excellent point about how social, economic, maybe even societal advancement really doesn't help as to if I'm, and forgive me for paraphrasing it, but really doesn't I won't say help, but doesn't have much of an influence on whether or not black men seem to appear or to look safer. Um,
Hmm.
I just wanted to know if you could kind of elaborate on that, spend a second with that, just because I know for a person like myself, my generation, I think we were told get a good education, keep your head
Hmm.
low, all of that good stuff. And we've seen in these mass killings of black men that it's been everybody from someone who uh, has pretty much just been men from all different walks of life. So could you kind of spend some time with us on that for a second?
Yeah. So are you referring specifically to the formability studies about how black men are perceived as bigger, stronger, more threatening?
Not exactly. You had a well, I guess in part.
Hmm.
But I just noticed that you had mentioned the piece about um there being sort of like a cognitive dissonance, if you will, around black men attaining a certain level
Hmm.
of economic advancement, educational advancement, and how and what that linkage is to how we are still perceived.
Yeah. Yeah. So class doesn't mediate threat perception for for black men because in some cases even a black male name can create a fight or flight response, right? Um, and this is I get in arguments with people in the field because now that we're trying to decenter sex and gender in ways that incorporate everyone, which I think is theoretically or conceptually fine, it overlooks what happens empirically, right? So if a black male presenting body walks into a space, that body is going to be perceived as a threat. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD. It doesn't matter if you have a suit on. You're going to be perceived as more threatening and violent or capable of violence than your white counterpart or your female counterpart. So that means that we have to start engaging different aspects of social proximity and proxemics, right? The space relation between different kinds of bodies, and how we think of the vulnerability that black men have to be fear inspiring, right? What Fanon talks about is phobogenesis. Black men then really have to dismiss the lies, right? I was told, hey, go to school, get a good education. It's what they can't take away from you, right? Okay. But then I walk through, not so much here in Europe, but if I'm in the United States, I walk through an airport, I walk through a social space, I'm profiled immediately, right? My PhD doesn't do anything, right? The fact that I'm a world renowned scholar doesn't do anything. So black men have to change their expectations. We have to understand both the concept of diminishing returns, right? So diminishing returns is the idea that education, socioeconomic status, etc., does not have the same protective benefit to black people as it does to other groups of people, right? That's the first thing. The second thing we have to understand is that there's a certain kind of I don't want to use the word I don't want to say it, but BS. There's a certain kind of pretentiousness of educational and economic advancement that specifically does not work for black men and boys. Right. See, we've treated black men and boys as like, well, look, they're just part of the racial groups that have to accelerate, to have to advance themselves, right? But that's not the case because we find that black people that are have higher levels of education suffer even more from, or black men specifically that have higher levels of education suffer more from depression. See, so what is it, right? There's that old saying of Wilson Vivaldi, right? Some of the work by Ron Livingston talks about how black men, even at the level of CEOs, have to have a disarming mechanism because people see them as any kind of knowledge or aggression. Even being more intellectual than a white person, more intelligent than a white person, is read as aggressive, right? And I've had lots of experiences of that. So we have to dismiss these mythologies that we think apply to a certain myth of social elevation, but are fundamentally excluded and just do not work and cause real harm to black men when they put themselves in these kinds of institutions and social spaces, right? And I think the data is pretty clear on this, right? That we have to start thinking about how people respond to black men and how to create positive self-worth amongst black men as a group itself themselves, rather than the idea that education or class status is going to give a magical force field that allows them to be seen as human when they're not. Dehumanization and misandric aggression have to be the foundational presumptions we use to analyze and diagnose black male social circumstances. We can't keep using humanism and the assumption of class mobility to remedy these problems regarding black men and boys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Curry.
Thank you, Dr.
I'm
Curry.
sorry. Gotcha. Very much appreciate you for taking this time out today. First
No
time
problem.
in Pittsburgh. Yeah. My understanding is your first time in Pittsburgh, so to speak, right?
Yes, yes,
Welcome to the hood.
virtually.
Right. Definitely appreciate it. I want to take a moment to give a quick shout out to both Staunton Farm Foundation and Poise Foundation. It is because of them that we were able to host this space since 2021. Our intention for as well dating to make sure that people have access to the support that actually works for them. In the ways that is not possible prior to. It's not uncommon to take more than months to years to find the right therapist or counselor, et cetera, et cetera. And to be black, that number, is exponential because it's not easy finding black clinicians or practitioners of both traditional and non-traditional backgrounds. So we created this space so that folks have access to their mental health resources. And like I said, it's not in Farm Foundation and Poise Foundation put the money behind it so that we can do this. And extend a shout out to our other supporters, so Pittsburgh Foundation, who's been rocking with us since day A. Always with my stuff when I'm like, hey, I got an idea. And they're like, all right, Shan, how we going to do it? Always here for them. Opportunity Fund, Hounds Foundation, and then of course, our neighbors, right? Like our biggest lift comes from our neighbors or mutual aid. So it is those small lifts that make up the biggest lift for us. That's how we're able to show up for each other. So from here, we are going to move into the mental wellness speed dating portion that is specific to Black men and boys who are present. So if you are a Black man, a Black boy, feel free to enter in that space. I know some folks had some difficulty with the ticket type. So if you are not a Black man and boy, but you happen to have a Black man and boy ticket, please don't enter into that space. It makes it unsafe for you to be there. Here for you, love you all. Like the next one will be open to everybody, but we wanted to make sure we were doing specific space for Black men and boys. All of our practitioners who are signed up are Black men and boys, or not Black men and boys, no, sorry, Black practitioners, both traditional and non-traditional, that you'll have an opportunity to meet with today. If you match with someone, let us know. If we do have, some financial support. So if you match with someone who doesn't take your insurance, or if you're underinsured or they don't take insurance or whatever the thing is, we do have the capacity to pay for up to 6 sessions so that you can meet at least one target with that preferred practitioner while we figure out how we figure out long-term care for you. So that's my all of my things off my list that I needed to say. I do want to thank you again, Dr. Curry. I have so much more to I wish this space was longer, but I do recognize that it is going on 8 o'clock for you.
Yes, it is.
Over there in the UK, so we're going to be, conscious about your time. I do hope that you hang around just a little bit after once the men are in the space, so we could chat a bit. But
Sure.
everyone else, we're going to close out this space. Black men and boys hit that mental wellness speed dating space. Our practitioners who are signed up for mental wellness speed dating, join them. Everyone else, there's a lounge area. There's different tables set with different questions around Dr. Curry's presentation. So feel free to sit and engage with each other. and ourselves. There's also some booths set up, virtual booths set up, discussing different things that we offer with the Wellness Collective. So if you're interested in what it is that we do, I know we're the new kids on the block, so many folks don't know who we are. So if you don't know, you'll be able to at least begin to know today. That's out there as well. So before we cut out, Chris, Devontae, did y'all want to say anything else in this space? No.
Nope, nothing for me besides thank y'all so much. And we appreciate the work that y'all are doing. Shout out to the Will folk.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody here as well for participating. Thank you, Dr. Curry, for sharing up your time and your talent and your resources. You've been truly a eye-opener for some, especially myself. It's very crucial here in the States to be able to put what we think and feel behind the data so that we can stand on it. So
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. All right. For everyone else, see y'all around. Please do, check out the lounge, check out the booths, Black Men and Boys, check out that mental wellness speed dating session, and we'll see you on the other side.